and top 10 80s movies. All right. First, before I get started on the top 10, I want to give some honorable mentions here. So there's a couple of
Ooh,
films that I
honorable
went back and
mentions.
forth on that that didn't quite make the list, and some of them were harder than others to bump down, but no particular order. Weird Science was definitely up there. Better Off Dead, Cusack film. In fact, it was the only one that was going to make the list. So it pained me to bump off Better Off Dead.
Wait a minute. It was
Um,
the only Cusack movie that was going to make the list?
for the '80s, yeah, because I feel like a lot
Really?
of his like better work was in the '90s
Okay. Okay.
and in the early 2000s, because High Fidelity was 2000.
Sure.
Um,
I'm
so
sure
yeah,
we're gonna
Better
have
Off Dead.
words later with that.
I mean, you could also I thought about putting Say Anything, but I don't know. For me, the comedy was better and Better Off Dead.
Sure.
Um, and
I was just
then
curious.
16 Candles, and there will be another John Hughes film on the list, but that one was another one I went back and forth. Same with Commando with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Definitely, you can't really mention 80s films without putting in, the action films from Schwarzenegger. So there will be another one on the list. And then The Princess Bride. That one I went back and forth for a long time, whether or not to include it in the top 10, but it definitely gets an honorable mention, probably right up there at like 11 or 12. And Stand By Me, probably the most difficult
Okay, enough
to
with you
leave off.
hating on us with all these honorable mentions. You put several that I would have put the list. Just get to the
So,
list.
all right, all right there, geez.
A
Yeah, a little aggressive there,
little
Brian.
bit. A little bit.
All right, so 10 and 9, they're kind of neck and neck, but I put them on here in no particular order. But we're going to go with Rambo First Blood for number 10. Uh, Again, a lot of action movies in the 80s, and I think Rambo was definitely one of the better ones, at least the first Rambo. After that, not so much, but I think
Absolutely.
definitely solid movie. Number 9, and this is where the Schwarzenegger comes in, is Predator. I think out of his body of work, especially in the 80s, I had to go with Predator over some of the others, including Terminator and Commando. Um, let's see. We got The Karate Kid at number 8.
Sure.
Classic 80s film.
Yeah.
If you grew up in the 80s, is definitely one that you watched. Um, 7. Top Gun. I mean, hey, the soundtrack alone puts it in the top 10. So let's see. Number 6, E.T., another classic. I
Yeah.
mean, Spielberg film. Um, there was some that I also left off for like different reasons. I also want to mention at this point, like I didn't have Star Wars on here, and the reason being is because it's part of like a trilogy and a larger world that really began in the 70s. So it kind of felt weird to try to separate out one to make it a quintessential 80s film. So there's
Technicalities.
Yeah, there's stuff like that where I'm like, I kind of left those off because they were just part of like either a trilogy or a bigger like, grouping of films that either started or really hit their stride like before or after the 80s.
So this
Um,
is, I guess, not to cut you off, but more of
mhm.
a. So this isn't so much like a quintessential '80s like movies that just feel the most '80s, right? This is what you think are just the best movies from the '80s.
It's kind of a mixture because when I was approaching this, I was like, there's different ways you can go with it. You can go with like trying to come up with some sort of objective criteria for like what are the best 80s films as far as like the gross and other stuff like that. And I don't know, that felt too stale
Sure.
for me. And then you can go with the complete opposite direction and say, well, what were my personal favorites? And that to me sometimes like isn't like relatable enough. So I kind of tried to meld the two with like a lot of these movies that are like when you think about an 80s movie, these would be on the list. So
Mhm.
it is kind of a quintessential 80s movies list, um, but kind of done in a different way.
I got you. That
So
makes sense.
yeah,
Are we done with the list?
no,
Oh,
no.
okay, yeah, I thought we didn't
Number
get to them.
5, Yeah, number 5 is Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Matthew Broderick, another classic. Um, and let's see, number 4 is Indiana Jones. So, and Indiana Jones, I went back and forth on whether or not to do Raiders or Last Crusade.
Always
So
a
I,
hard battle.
yeah, so that's kind of I don't know. I'll leave that up to you, but I think Indiana Jones, you got to have him on there somewhere.
Was Last
Um,
Crusade in the 80s?
yes, actually,
Huh.
89,
I
89.
did
So
not
the
know
whole
that.
series, the whole like original trilogy was in the 80s. So let's see, number 3. So this is into the top 3. Back to the Future.
Sure.
I mean, I really, if you think about like, if you're honestly going to sit and think about like one set of films that was like probably the most 80s, it might be Back to the Future 1 and 2. So.
Hover cars in
Uh,
the 2000s, awesome. What we get, the same old same.
And then, of course, you can't have 80s films without a John Hughes classic, Breakfast Club.
Sure.
So I think that
I begrudgingly disagree, but I'd
I
rather
I
the
mean
80s be off. What movie
I
again?
mean
16 Candles?
no, well, see, 16 Candles was in the honorable mentions. I think that as far as John Hughes films goes, The Breakfast Club was my pick.
Yeah, that would be my pick for the best John Hughes film, but it wouldn't be that high.
Yeah,
And
and go ahead.
well, I was going to say, you can't have a top 10 list about 80s movies and not include the queen of the 80s, Molly Ringwald.
Right,
Molly
exactly.
Ringworm.
And for the number 1, I picked The Goonies. I mean, it's just
Yeah,
I don't. You got a very 80s soundtrack, very 80s like adventure feel. You've got the like the kids and teens movies that were really popular. You have a lot of like adventure element to it. I don't know, just all around. I think it's one of those films that you watch and it has a lot of nostalgia and has a very 80s feel. So I think if I that topped my list is
Frankly, I'm a horde that there's no Tom Hanks on this list. I just am.
you know
Sorry. Was Big in the
yeah,
80s?
Big was in the 80s, and that was another one of the honorable mentions before you cut me off twice. But
see, Brian,
yeah,
if you had just let the man speak,
Well,
then we would
it's
have
supposed to
addressed this
be
already.
10, and he threw out all these honorable mentions, and I'm like,
well, that's why I was just going to list them off quick because no discussion about those. But yeah, so I mean it's hard to cut an entire decade that was really known for their films down to a 10 list. So but yeah, there again, I think Tom Hanks, it really did start to like hit his stride later on. I mean, I think Big was definitely good. Dragnet was good.
Bachelor
Um,
party.
yeah, yeah, and I think I don't know if Turner and Hooch was 80s or 90s, but um, yeah, I mean that could have easily made the list as well. But I think where you really see Tom Hanks come into his stride is in the '90s, and with Forrest Gump and Apollo 13, movies like
Sure,
that,
yeah.
and then Castaway in the early 2000s.
well, I'm a little disappointed there's no spoofs, but was there any good spoof in the 80s?
Uh, I'm Spaceballs.
Eh,
Yeah, that
That
wasn't the best. I'm like, no, no, it wasn't the best spoof. Airplane was one of the best spoofs I remember from that era. I don't think that was the 90s, though. I
I
mean,
think that was
80s.
70s. Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah, I was gonna say
70s.
I think
So,
Airplane was '70s.
same thing with
So,
Blazing Saddles. That was the 70s.
so First Blood, what was your number 9 again?
Number 9 was Predator.
Predator. Yeah. And then
Yep.
8, I didn't write a couple of these down.
8 was Karate Kid.
Karate Kid. God, that's a. And
Yep.
then where
Yep.
was Top Gun? Top Gun was 7 or 6?
7. Yep.
7. Okay. And
7.
then Ferris was 5, right?
Yep.
So I missed 6, my bad.
6 was E.T.
E.T.
Yep.
One
Spielberg.
thing, when I think of the 80s, I think of, this is going to sound weird, and don't take this out of context. I think of children's bedrooms. And the
Yeah, it's
most
weird.
Yeah.
80s children's bedroom that I ever remember seeing was in Neverending Story.
Yeah.
Neverending Story had the most 80s. Now, a lot of these, Goonies had a lot of good 80s bedrooms. Back to the Future had a decent 80s bedroom. And by 80s bedroom, I just mean like there just seemed to be shit all over the place.
I
Maybe
mean,
this,
Ferris Bueller's bedroom was,
yeah,
was
shit
fucking awesome. Yeah,
everywhere.
yeah, yeah.
Maybe that's a sign of how booming the economy was at the time.
Yeah, and you had a lot of electronics that kind of hit the mainstream and became more popular. People having like full blown stereo systems and stuff in their rooms and stuff like that.
Question:
And
Did you have any horrors on this list? Any horror films? Like,
No, because horror films suck.
oh fucking hell! Like The Thing would have been a good thing to put on that list. The Thing
Yeah,
was probably one
the
of
thing
the
was actually a decent movie,
best
but I
horror films.
yeah, and that to me kind of pushes into the sci-fi genre because like if you're gonna count stuff like that, like Alien was great as if you count that as a horror film. Um, I
But you
guess
got
it just depends on what you count as a horror film. I guess.
Well, you did get
'Cause-
Predator, which quasi horror, quasi action.
right.
Guess it's represented somewhere, but still not a very good horror
I just
represent.
always thought that like horror movies were some of the lamest and easiest like film genres. I mean, I don't know. Like all of them are just plotting like piles of junk if you ask me. Like I mean like your Child's Play and Friday the 13th and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. It just never did it for me.
yeah, I know there's been this whole resurgence of like hipsters being into the cheesy gore movies, and I do appreciate practical effects, so I respect the hell out of what a lot of those people were able to do without CGI. But in terms, I don't feel like they're good movies. They're good
No.
spectacles. They're a fun ride, but they're usually, in my opinion, in my experience, and I'm not a big horror movie guy anyway. I don't really want to see someone get decapitated for 2 hours. If I did, I'd just
Everyone's
go to
against me
Baltimore.
here.
And people making ridiculous decisions over and over for no apparent
Yeah, for
reason.
no fucking reason.
And you didn't put Ghostbusters anywhere, or is that one of the honorable mentions you cut out? That was number two on my list. Okay, it had comedy, it had some good action, definitely up there for
Ghostbusters
me.
did cross my mind, and that's probably something that I left off the list that could very well easily be argued that it should be on there.
Just gotta put it out there. The new ones,
Yeah,
eh, let me not get into that, okay? But the original 80s version, I mean, the sequel, but the original one was excellent.
unpopular opinion. I think that in some ways, Ghostbusters 2 is actually a better film. I thought it was funnier.
Okay, I can see that. As I said,
Yeah,
most people will argue against Ghostbusters 2. I thought it was fine, but I could see the problems with it.
Ghostbusters 2 was definitely funnier. I like Ghostbusters 1 more, actually, specifically because it wasn't as funny. You almost had to take it as just a sci-fi movie. Honestly, it wouldn't make a bad novel. If you read through Ghostbusters, it created a really nice atmosphere, I thought, of this like kind of paranormal world where these, quirky
Yeah,
guys were living. But then Ghostbusters 2 was a stronger comedy.
and and that's I think the I agree with you almost 100%, but for the same reasons that's why I liked Ghostbusters 2 better
Sure.
because you had these like comedy legends trying to do what felt like a darker like either sci-fi or like I don't know mystical movie, with like the some sort of I don't know if they call it another dimension or if it's like hell or whatever that they're opening up. Um, I forget what they actually go for, but I feel like they kind of like didn't utilize Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd, Harold Ramis, like as much as they did, comedy wise in the second one, and that's why I like the second film. I think a little bit better.
Sure.
Okay, and for the record, Airplane was the 80s, the very beginning
Okay,
of the
Wow.
80s. So I really
okay,
think
all
that
right.
should have had representation on the list. Oh, that's just my opinion.
As to me, spoofs are, I don't know, that if you're trying to make a top 10, like if you had a top 50 list or something, or even top 25, maybe you start seeing some spoofs on there. But again, I feel like spoofs are exactly what they're meant to be, a cheap laugh. And as far as putting them on the top 10 films of the decade, I would have trouble putting any spoof on there.
For the most part, I'd agree, with the exception of Airplane. I think Airplane is now maybe it's just because it's so far removed from like what it was spoofing for me that I always just took it as a straight up comedy and not so much of a spoof.
And
Uh,
Yeah,
I'm surprised Blade Runner wasn't on there. Okay, it's probably overhyped. It was my number
yeah.
nine. It was a really good movie with really good story. It's
I
just
feel like
something.
I don't know. I just feel like Blade Runner is one of those films that had like a cult following, and it just became the thing to say when you're making like those types of lists. It's just like, oh, Blade Runner, and it's kind of
sure.
kind of artsy, and I don't know, it's kind of film noir, and like it's a good film, and I like it, but I to me, there are times where it really bogs
Okay.
down,
Yeah,
stuff
I
like that.
understand why
So
it's not on the list, but
yeah, so it's kind of hard to like put that above some of the other stuff, like
it's
and
like
especially
putting the
when you're,
Rocky Horror Picture Show on a list of whenever that came out. It was horribly
yeah,
received.
yeah,
But
same
Blade
kind of
Runner,
deal.
okay. But you know my list. I'm going with the science fiction list because I'm more of a sci-fi geek. I mean, you guys are also, but
Yeah, yeah,
to a certain extent. But
Well, I
my list probably was more about representing the 80s as whole with my personal opinion. Like I put both Stand By Me because I thought that Stephen King needed some representation,
yeah.
and Better Off Dead was one of those things I was going to say just guilty pleasure, okay?
Yeah, same here. And if it was strictly about like, films that I would personally pick, like as far as like what I like the most, then Better Off Dead would probably be on the list, on the top 10 list. But like, trying to meld that like what was quintessential and what were some of my favorites, it got just narrowly bumped off.
yeah, I just want to go back to the Blade Runner thing because I have a lot of opinions about that. I do agree. The the things I really enjoy about Blade Runner are the cinematography, which is why I'm so glad that his name escapes me right now. But Blade Runner 2049 had the same cinematographer, and he won an Academy Award for it, which I think is great. And just the atmosphere, the world's building that they had going in Blade Runner, the story was
Don't laugh
fine.
at that. It's good.
I think he sneezed.
No, I
Oh,
just
okay.
coughed.
Okay. Sorry. I thought he was like, psst. Go on, Mike.
Well, that's pretty much it. I really like the cinematography of Blade Runner. I really like the special effects. I like the world that they build. I like that film noir aspect to it. I mean, I'm a sucker for a guy in the trench coat and a trench coat in the rain. But it wasn't to me overall. I wouldn't have. The only thing I maybe would have put it above E.T., but E.T. is such a quintessential 80s movie that'd be
I lost you on audio.
Yeah, same here. But yeah, ET, I mean, that was, I agreed with that one, even though it's not on my list. Oh, and on a related note, Red Letter Media recently had Mac or Macaulay Culkin, and he was reviewing a set 80s movie, which I thought was hilarious. Something that would never make any list called The Last Dragon. Just the joy that he expressed at this movie, which was like one of those old black exploitation movies, but almost a spoof with like a character's called something like Bruce Lee. I thought that was interesting. Red Letter Media, good guys. You guys should watch him.
Hmm.
okay.
Okay, but I think this topic is done. Unless
All right.
anyone else has anything to say on 80 top 10 80s movies.
Uh, no, I think I kind of said my piece about the kids' bedrooms and
Yeah, that another good one. You brought that up again. I was going to say earlier is Princess Bride, man. Like that, because it's
yeah.
kind of set in
Number 8 on my
in
list, but again,
yeah, yeah,
personal pleasure.
yeah, yeah, yeah. At the '80s bedroom. I thought about that one myself.
Right before Halloween, someone suggested I go as Carrie Yules from Princess Bride, even though obviously I'd have to dye my
You
hair.
killed my father. That could also work for Star Wars.
Like,
Yeah.
Empires was probably the would have been my pick for Star Wars. Empire Strikes Back. But you explained that it deserved a place, but it started in the 70s. Good logic.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it just didn't, it doesn't feel like an 80s movie. I always forget that
That's because it's
two of the
genre,
original trig.
futuristic.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It just feels, honestly, they all kind of feel like 70s movies to me. I don't know if it's the hair or the clothes or what, but
Yeah,